leave behind you will become a distant song. Every soul you loved will find you when you walk on. Oh, when you walk on. When you walk on.
Beautiful. Thank you, Jared. I'm going to sit down if you don't mind. Some of you know I've had a couple surgeries in the last month, so I'm just sort of recovering. I'm doing great, but it might be just nicer for me to sit down a little bit today instead of standing up and trying to talk to you. Appreciate that. And I want to tell you, I sort of have developed a bad habit. I don't know if anyone else does this at all, but when sometimes in the middle of the night, nature calls, you got to get up, and I grab, my cell phone is sitting there charging by my bed, so I just grab it and I use it like a flashlight just to kind of, so I don't step on the cat or something to find my way. But see, what happened last night was, and this sometimes happens, is then now I have my phone in my hand. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, and I go, oh, look at that, I have a message. So I said, well, I might as well, I'm up a little bit, so let me just check it out. So I look, and this was last night, and 2:30 in the morning, I got a message from a member of the congregation. And she was saying, hey, Pastor, I really wanted to give you some feedback about the sermon that you delivered a couple weeks ago. And that hooked me right away. So now I got to read. I couldn't go back to sleep at that point. So I start reading. What does she think? And it turns out she didn't like it very much. And she had some pretty direct and powerful things to say about it. The problem is that that's the exact sermon I was planning to preach today in this service, because I had preached it in the other services, but not here. So now you can imagine my problem, because it's 3 o'clock in the morning. I'm supposed to deliver this sermon in about 8 hours. It's the middle of the night, and now I'm starting to doubt my own message at this point. So I tossed and turned for a while, and I really thought about it, and I really felt that she had some very good points. It wasn't that what I was saying was wrong, it was just too narrow for the topic that I was talking about. And so I thought, how can I broaden this conversation? So I want to share that with you a little bit, this message, but it's definitely a newer version of the message, and it really comes in two parts. So I've asked Jared and Charla to play a little music. I'm going to finish the first part, and then they're going to play a little music, and then I'm going to invite Reverend Davis to come up and join me, and we're going to talk a little bit through the second part, because that's the part she took issue with, not the first part. All right? So what it is my message today talks about grief, and it's really powerful to have Jared here, because he played music as a gift to me and my family. We've been friends. He's been a friend of our families for a long time. When my daughter died back in 2006, and so that's really what I wanted to talk a little bit about, is that journey, because I start out wanting to tell you about a gentleman who had a beautiful office, very expensive high-rise office, New York City, a businessman, Park Avenue, who had on his desk a black rock. And people would ask him all the time when they came in, what is that rock? And he said, that's a piece of coal, because I grew up in a small coal mining community. My father was a coal miner, and even though I now have all this, I never want to forget where I came from and how I got here. And when I think about it, the Israelites in the Bible, when they left Egypt and they left slavery, they crossed through the desert for 40 years, it says, which basically just means a long, long time in the Bible, before they got to the Promised Land. But when they crossed over the Jordan into the Promised Land, they created a temple. They created a place to mark what they'd been through, because it's important to remember when we get to the other side of something, to remember what God has done for us, what life has done for us, what we've actually achieved. And so today I wanted to share with you something that helped me to get through the most difficult time of my life. And I wanted to share that with you. And then I want to apply that in the second part, with the help of Reverend Davis, to our larger culture. Because there's things that we can learn from our own grief that helps us understand how to move forward as a culture, particularly around the issue of race. That was the issue that I was talking about. So we'll get back to that in a second. The piece that was really instrumental to me that I want to share with you, and I did years ago in a message, and I brought it back in this message this year, is it's a myth about 3 horses. Some of you may recall. And the idea is that each horse represents a stage in our life, like an initiation in our life towards our full humanity. And so they don't necessarily go in order, but if they did, the order that we would like them to go in would be to start with the red horse. The red horse represents excitement and fun and risk-taking and playfulness. That we all have this part of ourselves that is a little bit the child inside that likes to take risks, that likes to test the boundaries, that likes to play. Now, hopefully, when we're young, we have an opportunity to experience that and have a lot of fun. That's why we're always happy when our teenagers actually survive their teenage years, because of all the crazy things they do, driving too fast, testing their own abilities in all kinds of different ways, doing risky behaviors and things like that. Now, what it's saying is we all have this in us, this desire to play and be a little bit reckless. And it has to have a place in our life where we can let it flourish and let it happen. So ideally it happens when you're young and strong and dumb and all that stuff, and you survive it, and then you move on with the rest of your life. But it doesn't always happen that way. You know, there's a part of us, it's like the Tom Sawyer inside every one of us, that when our auntie is calling us to get on our nice clothes to go to church, just wants to run away down to the river to go smoke tobacco and spit and curse with our friend Huck Finn. And if we haven't let that part of ourselves out, it's going to want to come out at some point. And so that's where, let me get to the next horse and I'll come back to that. So the next one is the white horse in the way that this myth is told. And in the white horse, it represents responsibility and community. So at a certain stage in our life, we decide that we want to be a part of a community and be responsible. So hopefully we take a job and we show that we can do that, and we can make money, and we might decide to start a family, maybe have children. We might start to volunteer for a church or for another organization. So people start counting on us, and we start showing, you know what, I can be responsible. I can do what I say I'm going to do. I can show up when I need to show up, and I can do that consistently. And so the white horse is this initiation into our sense of capacity to be a member of a community in a way that is helpful and allows us to be a part of something larger than ourselves. Now, the problem is, once you get on the white horse, if you've never had that red horse initiation, and all of a sudden you realize you have this playful, reckless part of you that you've never really lived, but now is saying it wants to be lived out, this is the stuff of midlife crisis. And even, you even see guys, getting red cars and drive, it's like a Mustang. It's almost like a red horse. And they start driving too fast, and they start engaging in risky behavior or crossing boundaries that they shouldn't be crossing and doing things because there's this part of them that wants to be lived out. Now that's dangerous if you've already started riding the white horse, because you have people who count on you, and you can destroy, and people do, their marriages, their careers, and everything else, because they start, this Tom Sawyer inside starts wanting to come out, and now they're not at the right stage of their life for that to happen. Now there are ways for that to happen once you're already on the white horse in a healthy way, if you know what's going on and you have a sense of how the soul is trying to come fully into its own. And so at that stage, you can do things like, people will do things like learn about mountain biking or whitewater kayaking or climbing or, all different kinds of ways that you can engage that playful part of yourself. It might be taking up some kind of art or dance or drumming or whatever, but there are ways to become a child again and let that playful part of yourself come out without destroying your family and all those parts of yourself. But the idea here is that we have to all go through all three of these stages in order to come fully into our humanity, fully into our compassion, fully into our wisdom. And so the third one is the black horse, which represents death. It's the baptism of tears that we all eventually go through when we lose somebody who we love. And we have to face death. And the problem with this black horse initiation is it is so painful and it is so difficult that it is very hard to stay on. It's a kind of a bucking bronco. You know, if you've ever dealt with grief, you know how difficult it can be and how unwieldy it can be. So what people will do when they're riding that black horse is they'll want to jump off and get on a red horse as quickly as possible so that people, instead of actually riding and completing the initiation of their own grief, they will jump to a bottle, or they will jump to an affair, or they will jump to something that will be fun and that will lift their spirit and that will keep them from having to deal with staying on that ride through the valley of the shadow of death that is so painful and so difficult. And so my message is about what I learned was I knew that I ultimately wanted to grow up and become somebody who could be seen as an elder in my own community, someone who was wise and someone who was compassionate. And I knew the only way that would happen would be if I rode that black horse to its completion, as tempting as it was to try to escape the pain of it in all different kinds of ways. And so that gave the grieving a purpose. And so that I knew that I could just stay in the heart of the pain because I knew it was leading me somewhere greater. Amen? So this is a problem because in our culture, we're not given permission to really grieve. We're not given permission to have what are often called negative emotions like sadness or depression or grief, sorrow. And so people often they say, get over it. You know, get through it. Come on, get past it. But we all know people, I know I did, who at the time, who were folks who had lost children 20, 30 years before. And every time I saw them, that's all I could see on their face. They were still grieving almost as if it had just happened. And I knew that for whatever reason, and I'm not here to judge anyone else's process of grieving and how that works, and everybody's situation is different. But what I understood was I did not want to be 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from that point still at the same level of grief. And I knew the only way out was through. Just like the Israelites, the only way out of slavery to the promised land was you're going to have to go through the desert. And we all go through the desert at different points in our lives. And so that's the first part of this message, is to say the only way out of our sadness, of our grief, of our pain is to go through it. And we have great horseback riders in this community, ministers, lay people, care team members, who can help when you're going through that kind of an initiatory moment through grief and sorrow, to help you stay on the horse and not jump off, so that you can complete the grieving, so that you can then move on. Because we all know people, if you don't grieve, what you're going to find is that it's going to keep haunting you. It's going to keep coming back over and over. And that's what we see. And we see it in our culture as well, because we haven't grieved some of the trauma of this culture of ours. And that's what Reverend Davis and I want to talk about in just a moment, after we hear a little music.
shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome the deep in my heart. I believe that we will overcome today. Oh, we will overcome today.
Amen. Reverend Davis, thank you for agreeing to help me out here.
Brother, as I said many years ago, I take it seriously whenever you talk to me because you are my brother.
I appreciate that very much. And what I realize is that the conversation that I was having in my message last time that I delivered this was I started to talk about the ways in which our culture has been built on a great deal of violence, and particularly racial violence. And so I was comparing that to I was comparing the trauma of the violence that has happened. We're talking about slavery, we're talking about lynching, we're talking about Jim Crow, we're talking about native what's happened to native peoples of this land, all of those pieces, and saying we haven't really reconciled ourselves, and we don't stay in the story long enough to complete the grief and the trauma, so these things continue to keep coming back to us over and over again. That's why we keep having Baltimores, Fergusons, Tulsas, and all those other things. And where I was brought to see a larger perspective was when in this message that I received last night, in the middle of the night, it said, you know, there's a broader story there than just the issues of racial violence. There's also some incredible stories of what people did in the midst of that violence and in the midst of that culture, and that I did not do a good enough job of balancing those things. So let me give you an example from the first half of this message, which is I talked about how painful that black horse initiation into grief and death and mourning is. What I didn't say much about was how in that time, as I rode that horse fully, I forged some of the closest relationships I have in my life. My marriage came through the other side of that stronger than it had ever been before. So there were all kinds of incredible things that also happened in the midst of it. And so I want to do a better job in this half of the message to balance this larger story. So what I want to do to start out is to say that there is a racial hierarchy upon which this country was formed. So that there was, and white supremacy is another way to say it. And there was ways in which that racial hierarchy has been reinforced and promoted using violence, right? Slavery itself, an incredibly brutal and violent practice. But even after slavery was over, we went to 8 decades of lynchings in this country that we never talk about. Very rarely talk about, certainly publicly. Over 4,000 documented lynchings that happened following slavery, many of which I learned were very public affairs, where people dressed up in their best clothes and they brought their children and they brought their wives, and they sold concessions, lemonade and ice cream. They took pictures. People went home with postcards to send to their friends. Now this is, when you think about this, Reverend Davis, this is when you have the leaders of a community doing acts like this in public with their children, with their wives, with their families around, that is saying to everybody, this is okay. When there's no legal repercussions, because only 1% of the people in all those lynchings ever had to deal with any due process, it is saying this is acceptable behavior. It's okay to do this to these people. That's part of what this nation was founded upon, and yet we don't talk about it, and partially because there's so much guilt and shame on the white side of that conversation. And so it's hard for white folks to hear that or to stay in the conversation. And what that does, though, by not having this discussion, is it reinforces this hierarchy. So let me give you a second to jump in here.
Sure. What it also does is for those who have been the people who've been victimized, those who know that history, what it also says is that you don't have confidence in a system to find justice. Mm-hmm. So then you must always hear one thing but believe another. Mm-hmm. That sets up a whole very difficult for outsiders to understand, but a whole way of listening. A whole way of hearing what people are saying. And you're always a little bit removed from being in the place on that side of it. Right. So I'm saying that not only do white folks want to dance around this issue of the history, black folks don't really want to believe you understand it in the first place. So whatever you say, it's like, okay, fine. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it did happen. Wasn't that horrible? So it's not a thing about anybody owning anything. And I think that's the first step when we're talking about reconciliation. You can't have reconciliation without owning the truth. Everybody has to own the truth of what my participation in it, and as well as others. Now, you mentioned, and I know you want to get there, but let's talk about when those relationships are forged, when you come out of this feeling much stronger because you realize that it's more than. You can't have an attitude of I'm all that and learn something new. See? So that's the other thing about what grief will do. Grief will put you on your knees. Literally. And being on your knees when you own that, and that's the truth of it, then you begin to seriously hear what's around you and see what people are saying to you that is touching the heart. So that's where I believe, because this is a sermon, church. I believe that God and Spirit is with us 24/7. There's a thing, a spirit. In the Greek, it's called paraclete. Paraclete, that's a Greek word. It means I'm running with you. Para, around you. The Spirit says, I'm not gone. You down here on the ground, I'm right here with you. Don't feel that this is who you are. You are gaining the strength that you will feel, because now you're at a place where you can hear me. When you're all up in there saying, okay, I'm going to outsmart the man, and you're doing a lot of that dancing, and then the man is saying, I want to treat you the way I think you deserve to be treated based upon the fact that I'm a white supremacist. And so all of that untruth is dancing around. No one hears the Spirit. But when you're down there on the ground, the Spirit is saying, okay, you ready? You ready now? You ready now? Because I'm ready to give it to you.
Right.
And when we receive that, that's when we start speaking truth to power. And that's when power begins to listen. Let me tell you something, because this is a sermon.
Yes, it is. Come on.
One of the things that is coming out of all of this attention on over policing and aggressive law enforcement is law enforcement is beginning to say, now time out. We need to come back here and get it right. Not just the military white supremacy power thing that goes over real well, but we need to listen to the folks. So there are all kinds of training that is going on to get policemen to a place where they're listening. You know what? I was listening on the NPR this morning, And I heard this policeman talking about this thing called procedural justice that holds up this automatic, let me show you power, and begins to listen. The very first thing in this is voice. And he says, it's not my voice. I have to listen to the person that I'm calling suspect, that I'm called to hear. I have to shut up and listen. And I'm saying, what?
Wow.
Law enforcement is getting it. You got to stop and listen. Now, there'll be times.
Come on.
Law enforcement is called on the scene. They have to react, and they're trained to react. But this guy is saying we are trained to first get the information. Stop, look, and listen. What's going on? You see a kid there. You got a call that said this kid is not a kid. This black male is chasing another black male with a weapon. The policeman said, I showed up and I saw this kid. The kid looked at me and I realized that's a kid. That kid is 14 at the most, maybe 15. And I don't believe that thing he has in his hand is really a gun. So what he did was he stopped, he looked, he listened. Everybody's looking at one another and he said, drop what you have in your hand. The kid did. It turns out it was a cap gun. He was chasing his brother. There was no threat.
Right.
And he spent time talking to the kid, talking to the mother. At this point, the mother was embarrassed. There were 8 police units out there in front of her house. She was going like, what? But it was a good time to begin to talk about what it meant to have that. Okay, so I'm saying all this. That's Paraclete talking. See, the Paraclete is saying, okay, we have a trauma in this nation. Now we're on our knees, law enforcement. Now you're ready to listen to me. Listen. Stop, look, and listen. I'll stop.
Beautiful, beautiful. That's right on. Thank you so much. So that's what I'm recognizing is starting to happen in this congregation through the programs that we have, like the Rewire or Groundwork programs and the Mosaic and the Storytelling for Justice that we did this last year and we're going to be doing more of. That we had a Soulful Sundown a couple weeks ago. I don't know how anybody at that? Okay, a number of folks. That was powerful. We had a gentleman who's a member of the church who talked about being in prison and becoming a Aryan brother, white supremacist. I mean, he talked very candidly about his past and his racism and his transformation from that. And some of the African Americans who treated him well, social workers after he got out and other things, even though he had these tattoos that identified what he believed about African Americans. And he couldn't believe that people would treat him with dignity in light of who he was presenting himself to be and what he really believed. And that transformed his heart. Incredible story. And he just stood there and told us all. And then another woman, African American woman who came, who in fact, well, I won't go that far. So it is maybe related to the email that I received last night. Who talked about as a young African-American child witnessing a lynching and the impact on her and on her life story. And when I realized that there were African-American woman spoke about losing a job because of her race. And what I realized, even as you're talking, Reverend Davis, that so often white folks will hear a story about racism and come up with all these, well, no, it wasn't really about that. It really wasn't.
Really
okay,
wasn't.
No, you really got to look at it this way. It probably wasn't about race. It was probably about something else, and we begin to start defending instead of just listening and taking that in and hearing what that story is trying to tell us and the feeling the humanity of the person who's telling it to us. So when I've talked about the Tulsa race riot, which we all know is, a riot back in the 1920s wasn't like a riot we think of today. A riot in the 20s was when white folks came in and they destroyed and decimated and killed people and massacred people in a black community in this nation. It happened in about 19 different cities and towns around the United States, the worst of which was here in Tulsa in 1921, and the anniversary was a week ago. When we talk about that, often white folks will come out and tell me, but you didn't mention there were all these good people who helped, and there were all these good white people who helped in this way and that way. And I said, well, there's time for that story too, but today we're telling the other part of that story that doesn't get told. But it's hard for white folks sometimes to just sit and hear that's part of the story. And so, as you're saying how we need to listen to each other, what I'm realizing is what we're doing at All Souls right now, and we're going to really dive even deeper next year, and I hope you'll be a part of it, is we're continuing to build our capacity to listen to one another and to honestly share our stories with one another, which, as you've said, is very much an act of the Spirit.
Yeah.
Speaking through us.
Yeah. I want to say something about this whole process of getting to what All Souls is doing. I've said this before. All Souls is like a laboratory, right? And you know how it is. You know, the experiments sometimes don't go right, you know. But you're in the lab. That means that you're committed to finding some answers. You're committed to figuring it out. And that's a little different from a church. Because, see, that's why a lot of folks leave church, because they don't like the answers that they're coming up with. And they say, I don't feel good. I don't go over here. And so people, and you're free to do that. But in order for us to really get at what really needs to be answered, in order for the rest of the world to see us in the city of Tulsa, to see us as a place where things are really going on, you got to stick and stay. You gotta hold on. So there will be times when we stumble and folks get their feelings hurt. That's why I was praying about forgiveness, because you can't go into anything working with human beings and you don't have forgiveness.
That's
Lord
right.
have mercy.
That's right.
You can't do it. You can't model a philosophy that is showing you it is not in for the long term. White supremacy is not something that is going to be forever and ever. All around the world, folks are coming up with different versions of how to deal with this thing. You know, you got to let that thing go. The police are saying we got to let this thing go, because this is the end result of it. You will have people hurting one another. So what I'm saying to us is that we may make mistakes. We may make bumps. You may get kind of out of joint there. It's okay. Own it. What you did, Reverend, I didn't like, blah, 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 blah. This brother right here, the reason why I called him my brother, if you have had a sibling, you know you have had fights. Right?
Oh, yeah.
We have had fights. And we have agreed, tears have been shed. But we have agreed to come back together because there's something bigger than just my ego and his ego. And we said, man, we got to do this. We got to do this. And we have. And I told him, I'm not ashamed to say this. I'm not ashamed to say this. He's my brother, and if he said, man, I say when, where, how. That's all I'm asking. It's not about yes or no. Right? That's because we've gone through stuff. Same thing for this church. Go through it. Go through it. It's the wilderness. But we go through it together. I'm going in and out.
Yep.
I'm going in and out, but we're going together.
All right.
So here's what I want to say. Here's what I want to say. When you feel just like that email or text at 2:30 this morning, say it. When you feel like something, I don't understand it, or I got another, say it. That's what makes this different. We seek the truth in love.
That's right. That's right.
You gotta say it. You can't hold back and to somebody else about somebody. You can't do that. You got to come to that somebody and say, look, let me tell you what happened. Let me tell you how I felt. Help me through this. And the other person, if they're an All Souls person, they'll know what's going on. They'll say, okay, this is what it is. So it's not about banging up on one another and beating somebody down. No, it's not that. It's about let's seek this truth in love.
Here's a microphone that you can use. It's
all right, I can use that.
Reliable if you want.
If I want. All right.
Okay.
All right.
So thank you. Reverend Davis and I, as he mentioned, have been through a lot together. And one of the things I think that keeps us from being in these kinds of relationships across our differences is the fear of hurting one another initially. And then once you get over the fear and you start to actually be in a relationship, then you actually do hurt each other because you can't help it sometimes. Mm-hmm. And then it's the pain of realizing I've hurt my brother or my sister in the process of just trying to forge a relationship and to be real together. And so to know that in our relationship, Gerald, we agree to stay at the table and have agreed through some hard times to do so, I know that I can say whatever I'm thinking, and you will correct me if you feel necessary, and that we will find some, and you know that I will listen if you've got some critique. And I hope that you as a congregation know as well that I will listen. If you send me an email, even at 2:30 in the morning, the night before I'm about to preach a sermon, that I am going to take it in and I'm going to listen, because what we're doing is there's no map for this.
No.
But the thing is, people shy away from actually having the conversations because they're afraid they're going to make mistakes. They're going to look silly publicly. Nothing is worse than standing up in front of hundreds of people and putting on YouTube a sermon that you find out later you missed the mark. But at the same time, I'm not going to be afraid of missing the mark to the point where I stop trying to speak the truth in love as I understand it. So let us commit to speaking the truth in love in this congregation. Let us do the hard work that it takes. Let us cry together. Let us not be afraid of the pain. Let us know that we can ride through any pain and the worst losses that we could ever imagine. We can do this together, and that's what community is about. And I truly believe that's what God is asking and calling us to do.
Yes.
So bless you and thank you.
Amen.
Brother.
Thanks for tuning in online. We are so pleased with all the different people who have been tuning in from all over the country and all over the world to our ministry and what we're doing at All Souls here in Tulsa. If you have a chance to send me an email or connect with me in some way, let me know what you're finding, why you tune in, and what you're getting out of it. I would love to hear from you. I'm always pleased when I get messages from different people who tell me all kinds of things about the impact of All Souls Tulsa's ministry on them and their lives and their families. And if you get a chance to make a gift to support this ministry, to become a partner, we would love to partner with you and have you be a friend of the church and somebody who is actually supporting us to create this congregation and the world that we're trying to create together. You can be a part of it, and every gift of every amount makes a difference. We really appreciate your support.